Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Corinne Costell and today I would like to share with you my research project that I have done through the Office of Student Research at Roosevelt University for my Spring 2021 research project entitled Exploring Issues Such as Systemic Racism and Cultural Appropriation in Opera. Now, what exactly does this mean? To me, this means getting closer to the underlying root of systemic issues within classical music, more specifically within opera, and how myself and others can combat these said issues as they occur. This includes systemic racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, many issues we as a society are currently grappling with, but within classical music, these structures are at the very foundational root of classical music, not only due to the messages and constructs found within the repertoire, but how they are alive and well within the very rehearsal room in which these productions are created. With these constructs being present, by remaining silent on these issues, we are accepting the objectification and commodification of people of color in opera. While this has always been an issue, the year 2020 brought about phenomena that disrupted the normal flow of society with heavy and very serious issues. The COVID-19 pandemic, which is currently still ongoing, has affected the entire globe with alarming infection rates of the virus, which has caused several lockdowns, quarantines, and new rules of social distancing and self-isolation. While the effects of this virus have been endless, one of the more significant effects, especially towards the beginning of the encroaching pandemic, has been our ability to reflect on our core values and morals, both as individuals as well as citizens of the world. This then led to the influx of Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, which allowed communities of color throughout the nation and across international borders to voice the endless grief of losing people of color, specifically Black and brown folks, to police brutality. In addition, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of extra time and space in order to express this frustration. Undeniably, the summer of 2020 proved to be a deep introspective look upon our own contributions and perpetuations of white supremacy and white dominance. Many companies and corporations during this time made marketing and networking decisions to promote their choice of standing with the Black Lives Matter movement, which had not happened in such a capacity before 2020. While it can be argued that many of these sentiments are mostly performative, the close magnifying glass upon these industrialized institutions allowed accountability to begin to take place on a substantial level. This also includes traditional forms of art such as classical music and opera. And that is how my journey first began. Once I saw the vast effects of this across the nation, I decided I no longer could take a back seat to how this affects operatic standards. I instead wanted to reclaim the sort of autonomy I have as a performer. So where exactly did my research take me? Well, I wanted to focus on classism in opera and how that translates into modern-day racism in many contexts. Class, Control, and Classical Music, a book by Anna Bull, addresses the power dynamics and the hierarchical format of classical music performance, as well as how an initial journey into learning classical music upholds centuries-long traditions of elitism, classism, and even sexism, with control over the way women in particular are allowed to express themselves and their emotions. Some of the centralized themes in this book addressed exactly what I thought were the underlying issues that plague the music industry on a deep systemic level, which is hard to pinpoint and call out, especially as performers. Speaking of which, as performers, we lack a certain autonomy over the repertoire we sing, and in some cases over the way this repertoire is expressed and performed. Since the opera industry operates almost solely through donations, much of our opinions and commentary as performers are well overlooked. The two following graphs showcase the jarring lack of representation there is of people of color in the music industry, both in grade school and higher education. While Bull's book discusses the disparaging number in England specifically and how they reflect classism, for my work I searched for how this reflects as racism. This stems from centuries-long generationalized oppression and segregation, which is outlined very clearly within the classical music westernized canon. This is the body of art that is defined as high culture set by westernized standards. The exclusionary aspects of this culture run deep in tradition, and that doesn't escape from today's standards. Moving on to current issues, many associate the Metropolitan Opera as the pinnacle of opera performance in America. While this institution is highly regarded, there is still clear and blatant racism that that occurs within the Metropolitan Opera. As recent as 2015, Anna Netrebko appeared in a production of Aida by Giuseppe Verdi in blackface, a practice that has been almost effectively removed from our country's vernacular as far as publicly accepted performances. So why was this included in a production in the 21st century? Also new to the 21st century, we have social media to record and display our human interactions on the internet for the entire public to consume. The Instagram page, Opera is Racist, documents the kinds of interactions people of color experience within the operatic world, spanning from microaggressions to overtly heinous acts of racism. This page was only created in June of 2020 and already has hundreds of submitted posts. For example, a post mentions, "As a Latin American conductor, I was told that classical music from Latin America is not recorded often because it is not as good as European music. Here, we can see how much the idea that the Western canon of European music is superior and that it is factual and cannot be disputed, even though the entire idea behind this structure is to exclude and ostracize other cultures who are seen as different." Another post explains, "I work at one of the largest houses in the UK where we recently did a production of Othello. For reference, Othello is an opera also written by Giuseppe Verdi that follows the storyline of Othello, a Moorish commander of the Venetian Armada. Since performers of color were only allowed to perform in the late 20th century, the libretto of this opera explains how the lead of Othello needs to be painted darker, which now translates into blackface." The quote continues, "Othello himself was sung by a white man. I expressed my distaste at this and was met by many colleagues explaining that there were simply no black tenors who could even sing the role, so there was no choice in the casting. After each stage rehearsal, the conductor would insist that the guy playing Othello wasn't dark enough and kept on feeding this note back to makeup staff. They did what they could to make him look as sun-kissed as possible, and no one ever called him out because he is the most influential guy in the house. Again, we can see that the power dynamic in this industry between administration and performers creates a very toxic environment in terms of calling out and addressing racist and harmful tactics in the rehearsal room." Lastly, within my research, I came across an article from Van magazine entitled "The Insurmountable Wall." This article explains some missteps taken by the Aspen Music Festival in their 2019 production of South Pacific. This musical, written by Rodgers and Hammerstein, intended to display a message about racism, but also includes a score that had preserved Pacific Islander stereotypes and an anti-Japanese racial slur. The article mentions, "It was so offensive to one student in the orchestra that he had decided to approach festival administrators with his concerns. He alleges that they did not respond positively to this conversation. Shortly afterward, he received a message from his private teacher. 'You need to apologize,' said the teacher, 'for the sake of your career.'" Eventually, my research, through a suggestion by Laura Nussbaum-Barberena, stumbled upon the Theater of the Oppressed, a theater forum created by Augusto Boal, first in Brazil and then eventually in Europe in the late 1970s. These theater techniques promote social change and conversations about social justice through a mode of improvisation and play. The creation of this type of theater encourages the performers to break down biases and remove the formalities of what society expects of us in order to enhance their skills of breaking through these barriers. This is also encouraged for audience members, as Boal claimed there are no spectators in theater, instead spect-actors. Audience members are encouraged to stop performances in their tracks and tag in for performers in place in order to express their own opinions about the circumstances happening on stage. The way these theater techniques were taught fell into certain categories of games, labeled as image theater, forums theater, legislative theater, invisible theater, etc. According to ImagineAction.org, this ideology originally developed out of Boal's work with peasant and worker populations, and it is now used all over the world for social and political activism, conflict resolution, community building, therapy, and government legislation. This idea was originally based off of a methodology of a similar name, the pedagogy of the oppressed. This methodology, created by Paulo Freire, which took a further in-depth look at the relationship between student and teacher and how that varies in conversations relating to the colonizer and the colonized. This methodology is now considered one of the foundational texts of critical pedagogy. And now I want to show you a short clip on imagineaction.org and how they produce their own Theater of the Oppressed within the Pasadena Theater.
Imagine Action and the Pasadena Playhouse co-created a community-devised forum play. Forum theater is a process which allows audiences to explore ways to change their world.
And when you see someone, you're going to say hello. So one of the actions in theater is the hello, the welcoming, the connection with someone. Yeah? So we walk.
My name is Yuni.
Y después cambiamos de silla. ¿Listo?
My name is Helena.
And we keep the spirit.
Forum theater begins with play.
Okay, ¿todos tienen de atrás? Vamos a hacer esto. Miren los tres que tienen. Léanlo.
The Pasadena Playhouse and Imagine Action partnered with a handful of local organizations to provide free theater workshops to 130 Pasadena community members.
That begins right here. You can talk, but you cannot move. Try to figure out what is happening between these two people. Ready? By listening and talking. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Forum theater asks us to look at conflicts in our communities and address the possibility of change through play.
Ahora el que era el doctor es el paciente, el que era el paciente es el doctor. ¿Listo? Y es la misma. This is improvising. You know everything you need to know to do this. Because why? We all have memories. We all have our bodies. We all have our imagination. It's that we're here starting to activate that muscle. Like going to the gym to develop a muscle. That's what we do with these things.
It allows us to connect with the part of ourselves that is curious and ready and able to improvise. Improvisation means that anyone can create without preparation. It means that community members can share their voice and their world with others. Improvisations include the exploration of voice, movement, and allows individuals to express what is of concern in their communities. From this process, stories are gathered and woven into a community-devised forum theater play, which asks a specific question about conflicts within the community. The bilingual play devised here is titled Estamos Aquí, Where Do We Go? In it, we follow a Pasadena undocumented family working several jobs with questions about mental health and a grandmother who wants to return home.
Buenas noches, familia.
No need you anymore. Y ya me corrió.
Todos para uno,
Now, after reflecting on that video, I thought about what my own working group would look like in the context of trying to translate this into operatic standards. So after reflecting on everything I have just described, I decided to create my own working group dynamic, a sort of dreamlike scenario of what a workshopping operatic environment could look like. Where we would have conversations about systemic racism, sexism, and other harmful oppressive tactics, and these conversations would be encouraged and in the end bring us closer to unity and allow white identifying individuals to put action behind the words of being an ally. So what exactly is the purpose of this group? Well, I decided to organize this group in which we would explore the potential paths we can take as proactive allies instead of just offering emotional support. This action takes place through discussions of current sightings of racism, the games created from the theater of the oppressed, as well as role-playing in order to deconstruct our own biases. The intention was to learn how to address issues of racism through such as microaggressions and cultural appropriation within healthy, productive conversations focused around education and positive reinforcement. The theater games were also instilled to provide a way in which that we could reconnect with our bodies and minds so that way we could have these conversations in positive and structuralized formats. The structure of this group centered a group total of 7 white identifying individuals who took a commitment of initiating their journeys towards becoming reliable and proactive allies. This was meant to be educational for white identifying people as to lift the burden of education off people of color and other marginalized groups of people. While we recognize that there is never a definitive endpoint to being an ally, here we can navigate discussions and gain perspective upon situations involving systemic racism while the stakes are low and safe. This further prepares us for unexpected interactions that may occur outside of the group so that that way we are equipped with the proper knowledge on how to handle these situations and as to not internalize these microaggressions and further perpetuate white supremacy with our silence. This group met a total of 10 weeks, spanning most of the semester, meaning an hour weekly on Friday mornings. So here I have posted a screenshot of a lesson plan that I had provided for one of our meetings in March. As you can see, we started with an article entitled Cultural Bridges to Justice, an article that speaks about diversions into white guilt, denial, defensiveness, etc., always to detour away from racially charged conversations. I wanted to include this in this particular series because these are red flags that we can see within others, but also as well as within ourselves. And these red flags are important to recognize as we become more focused and comfortable with conversations centered around racism. We would spend about 15 to 20 minutes discussing these topics and engaging in conversations that ask certain questions that provide more insight and knowledge into these types of topics. From there, we would move on to warm-up games, and most of the warm-up games that I had chosen for this group were more traditional theater-like games that focused on energizing and moving bodies so that way we can engage in our own physical life and be prepared for heavier topics that the theater of the oppressed also engaged in. Even moving forward too, in the same exact week, I also included a theater game entitled Gibberish, in which 2 players would enact a story, one of which who was telling a story in gibberish, and the other who was communicating what the other person was saying. This gets us away from traditional language barriers and instead encourages the group to focus on inflection and body language and movement in order to communicate and tell a story. It is always surprising to see how much one person can communicate without using actual language. From here, then we would move on to Theater of the Oppressed techniques, which I had detailed below. I wanted to include the idea of form theater, in which we saw in the video that I had just played. Form theater was the moment of performing a scene that depicted problems within the community, more or less what some people can experience, and as far as oppression within the community, and how we can focus on that change of the moment. This includes audience participation. So I encouraged the group to watch one time through the first scene that depicted these scenarios, and the second time through, the remaining group members were encouraged to stop and participate and switch places with one of the active members of the group in order to express their own ideas that can center around change and almost have an intervention-like reality as far as their own backgrounds. A different week, I wanted to include the theater of the oppressed idea of image theater. So I wanted to include games that focused on individualized images that we don't necessarily think of in our conscious self, but our unconscious constantly thinks of these things. For example, in the game Individual Images, the group would face away from their cameras, and I would count down from 3 and speak a word, and immediately upon that word being spoken, the group would then turn back to the camera and immediately enact a certain gesture and frozen image of that word. As you can see, I chose more light-hearted topics to begin, such as light, box, music, dark, chocolate, and then moving into heavier ideas such as passion, youth, friendship, fear. In other weeks, I also had used the words masculine and feminine because these are words that are very charged with certain preconceived notions of what those words are supposed to be and look like. So in terms of the actual game, we are encouraged to be silly and work in play mode, so that way our bodies can take over, similar to how an inkblot test tests our knowledge of what the first impulse of what we have to say comes to mind, and that translates into image theater by us enacting our gestures and putting physical life to our immediate impulses, which are good to recognize as we move forward, because this unlocks a lot of internalized biases that we may or may not have already known prior to this conversation. So what exactly were the takeaways from this project? I found that this project provided a solid platform with very low stakes to practice our values and learn how to navigate spaces where we will be challenged by higher up positions in future career paths, not only in operatic performance, but in other career paths as well. Overall, I felt that the group experienced a solid amount of growth over the 10 weeks that provided a network in which we could all explore, learn, and grow together. Now, while this group did meet over Zoom, my intention was to have this in a public space where we could meet in person for the theater games that rely heavily on person-to-person contact. Since I was hindered by our experience on Zoom, but enlightened in other ways, I thought about the potential uses for this project going forward. I looked at this project as a starting point and a foundation to grow upon these ideas, so that way I can build and create a more focused and more constructive and progressive format of a workshop. So there are many potential uses that I have going forward for this project. Since it was very introductory, I believe there is much to be researched and grown from this initial project. From feedback that I have received from others, I could go into the direction of being an artist consultationist, public relations coordinator for opera houses, a traveling educator for opera houses to collaborate with ideas on repertoire and how to create safe rehearsal room practices. I could even develop a curriculum or textbook for fellow educators, or even develop a thesis with a musicology degree. Overall, I felt this was a great starting point for my journey, soon to be developed further. And lastly, I just wanted to take a look at the types of questions I asked the group, both at the beginning of the group as well as the very end. These were done in the form of questionnaires that were anonymously answered and responded to. and that would provide me some insight on both the participants entering the group as well as exiting the group. The initial questionnaire focused on the background of participants, asking them what kind of upbringing they had, what kind of environments they grew up in, and also what kind of biases and experiences with racism they already had entering the space. For example, the question, have you ever encountered any situations or conversations centered around racism that have made you feel uncomfortable? 100% of participants responded yes. And here is a response from one member on a follow-up to this question. I came from a predominantly white school district to a predominantly white college, then to a very diverse but heavily segregated city of Chicago. I was very ignorant and had to unlearn my immediate racist tendencies the hard way sometimes. I've said things that people called me on, and I found myself getting defensive. And once I figured out where that came from, I learned to place blame on myself as well as my upbringing, and I was able to get past that feeling and think I am more adapted to having those harder conversations and being more aware of the things I say and do and how they might affect others. The second questionnaire asked participants to recount their journey over the 10-week period and how they feel going forward outside of the group. The response to the question, were there any specific biases that you feel you have begun to break down on an individual basis? This response really stuck out to me. For me personally, I would say my radicalization was made solid and pushed over the edge in the heat of last summer's protests and climate. I guess what has been done personally is a passion to start thinking of others more, and believing that I have the power to change things, knowing full well I alone do not. It is all about finding what works for you and associating with groups dedicated to making a positive impact and that are actively following through with doing so. The biggest takeaway from this group for me was that nothing we discussed is particularly hard to implement. Having more awareness is key, but also a love and respect for all life, as well as a willingness to fail and learn from those failures without expecting anything in return, are crucial toward being a good cast member and person. So with that being said, I thank you all for joining me today. I look forward to developing these ideas further and creating a more robust workshop plan. And here are some works that I have cited that I have used to create this presentation. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.